Hello and welcome into another edition of Huber and Friends. And when I started this show, I had three folks that I wanted to get on as my first two guests. Grant Paulson and Emery Hunt came on pretty quickly. This guy became a bit of the great white whale for me, but I'm glad to get him on. Kevin Sheehan,
We
so
tried.
so glad to have you on Huber and Friends finally.
We tried a couple of weeks ago, and for whatever reason, my technology where I wasn't working, so we rescheduled. But I'm just glad to be mentioned in the same company as one Grant Paulson. That's really an honor, honestly.
Well, I'll tell you what, Kevin, you were up there on my list of guys help me out in my career, and always love to chat with you. And this is going to be fun. Let's start off here. It's an easy question. How do we meet?
How did you and I meet?
Yep.
We met at Triple X ESPN Radio many years ago, 18 years ago now, probably, because I was at TEM and Dan Snyder decided to start this company called Red Zebra. He hired Bennett Zier to run it. Bennett hired Todd Castleberry, who was our, general manager of the station, and he came to me and I think Bram and said, "Want you guys to come work for this thing." I remember being a little bit skeptical about the whole thing, but once Rigo was in, then I was like, "This could be great." And you and Dave Preston, who is still on TOP after all these years, you've been on Sirius XM forever. Hear you all the time, especially in the morning or during the Mad Dog show in the afternoon. But you guys were doing updates during our show, which would have been 18 years ago, right?
So we got a little bit of a sidetrack on this. So I came in there as a nighttime producer. I was literally doing like the 12 to 6 in the morning, Friday into Saturday.
You weren't on the air right from the jump?
No.
Oh.
So we'll get into this. So
Okay.
here's how this, and you mentioned Brams. This is good because you guys were the two big helps for me there. Bram, who I knew from doing some American University games with, I saw him at camp one day. I said, "Look, man, I keep sending my resume. Like nobody responds to me." He goes, "Look, send it to Vinny Bruce. They'll hire you." So I sent it to Vinny. Vinny hired me immediately to do that shift. And Kevin, you know this as a former youth coach. I was coaching youth football. So I would be going from literally doing a high school football game at night, driving to Silver Spring, doing that 12 to 6 shift, maybe getting 2 hours sleep if I was lucky, then getting up for like a 9 o'clock football game. And of course, the funny part, I was still in my 20s at that point. So I would make sure that I went up to the parents and talked to them to make sure they didn't think I had been drinking all night. They could tell I didn't have booze on my breath. No, I just got 2 hours of sleep because I ended up getting no sleep from doing this radio shift. The second thing that happened was we were there. I was doing this, and I think it was either possibly you had back issues. I think you might have had a surgery at that point.
I did.
And Bram also had some commitments with the Skins. So you kind of were like, I think you had heard that I had done updates. You're like, "Hey, you do updates, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I've done them before." "Okay. All right." And I think you went and talked to TC, Todd Castleberry, and you're like, "Yeah, Huber can do the updates." So that's how I got my chance to get on the air. So basically between you and Bram kind of looking out for me, that's how I got the chance to be on there with Presto, who was an original update anchor.
Right. Yeah, Dave was the original. You just reminded me of something because you mentioned I was having back issues. That was the first back surgery I got. I've had like 3 of them, lower back discectomies. They're not really that big of a deal. But I did a post-game show with Jacoby in that studio, lying on my side, like up against the wall with ice. And I think it was probably the next day I had surgery or 2 days later, and you came in and took over. And you were great right from the beginning. I remember that. You've always had, the voice, the cadence, and could write. As you know, that's always an underrated part of doing updates, is writing. And we were off and running in that just awful world building where there were mice running around and desks. And I did every pregame and postgame show from there for road game. No, for road games that first year, and would watch the games with Jacoby in that back office with that little, it was maybe a 19-inch flat screen. It was so small, but it was hysterical.
Yeah, it was an interesting spot to be in, that's for sure. And I think I do remember a couple times I think you were healing, but you were basically reclined. I think maybe they had some type of chair. It wasn't a normal chair. You were kind of reclining back and doing. I think you had a microphone on your chest. This is how old it was, folks. We didn't have these mic arms. We actually
Yeah.
had the mics with the stand, and Kevin kind of had it on his belly and was kind of getting that perfect position where he wasn't feeling extreme pain. So
Yeah.
you were a gamer back then, Kevin.
Yeah.
Uh,
Hardly.
we'll get back into that, I'm sure, but we got to go back. And I think this is always the interesting part about you and this show is we kind of find backstories on people. And you've got a really rich sports history as a fan in this town. I know you've talked about before. I believe you were at the 1982 NFC Championship game, which is a dream for a lot of folks. I mean, I was 3 at the time, but I always say if I could get in the time machine, that's the game I would gonna want to go to. Where did this love of sports for you come from?
My father was a huge sports fan. We were one of the lucky, families that had Redskins season tickets. He got them when the stadium opened in 61, when it was DC Stadium. And it was my uncle, my father, and I who went to the games every Sunday. Now, I started going when in the early 70s. George Allen's the first coach I remember. I don't remember Lombardi or anything before that. The 71 season is the first season I remember. And we were huge Redskins fans and huge Maryland basketball and Maryland football fans. And that was it, because the Senators were leaving. There was no basketball NBA at that point. The Bullets came a couple of years later, and I became a huge Bullets fan and went to as many of those big games that they had in the 70s as the Redskins had in the 70s and 80s. But and there was and the hockey was, we weren't a hockey town when the Caps showed up by a long shot. But yeah, my father was always huge sports fan. My father was a basketball coach. And we loved basketball, played basketball, but we were, devout Skins fans.
You talk about playing basketball. I've heard you talk about your days, and I believe it was Walt Whitman playing high school basketball. What'd you take from your time on the court? I know we always say that I think it's good to have some background in these sports, and again, high school level, whatever, college, but to kind of know when criticism is valid and when not valid. What'd you kind of take from your time playing hoops at Whitman?
Well, I had a really good coach. His name was Marty Dickerson. And he passed away about 3 or 4 years ago at a young age. I think he was like 68, 69 years old. But he actually came to coach us in our senior year. He had coached Blair to a state championship a few years earlier. And what we lacked in talent, we made up with no size, basically. And we lost like the first 4 or 5 games by like an aggregate of 100 points. Like we got beat by 20, 25 each game. And it's one of the best sports lessons and experiences all of us who played for him ever had. He came in on a Saturday morning after we got drubbed on Friday night, and he installed a double high post delay offense, no shot clock back then. And our next game was at Blair. They were ranked 10th in the city, I think. And we held the ball. We went into a delay game right from the beginning. The score was 3-2 at halftime. We lost 19-18 in double overtime. And we played that way the rest of the year, and we started to win games. The scores were like 35-33, 28-26. We got very proficient running this offense. All we were taking was like backdoor layups, but we would, lull the defense to sleep. It was frustrating for our opponents. And it was such a great life lesson about there are lots of different ways to compete and to win. And he was smart and he was tough. I remember that. But he was really smart to do that. And we missed the playoffs by 1 game. We won like 7 of our last 10 games. And if we had gotten into the Montgomery County, the Maryland State playoffs, no one would have wanted to play us because of the style of play. So that's my best memory of high school basketball, was playing for Marty Dickerson. A lot of guys played for Marty. He took the team 2 years later that he coached to the state finals, and then became the head football coach. He was just, kind of built to deal with young people and to coach. And that was a great life lesson. Everybody's got those stories with, sports, with teachers in school. And he was really a big influence on a lot of us.
Kevin, you would move on to Maryland, that school that you had rooted for as a kid. You go on to there, and you kind of catch it during the tail end of that really good Terps run into the mid-'80s. What was College Park like back then?
A lot different academically, a lot different. Like, if you had a pulse, you could get in if you were in state, basically. The school is such a great school now. I mean, it's a wonderful university, and it's academically incredibly difficult to get in. It's totally different. Maryland back then was a lot of in-state kids from the state of Maryland, a lot of Jersey, New York, Philly, and there was that aspect of it. And by the way, that was great for Cole Fieldhouse and the fan base to have that, the Maryland Eastern Shore contingent with the Philly contingent, with Jersey and Long Island in the house. And it was just one of the best environments there was in college basketball. Lefty was coaching. Every game was important. Every game was a big deal. Maryland football, I was there during the Bobby Ross years. They were great during those years. They were always ranked in the top 20. One of those years, they were the preseason #1 team in America in Sport Magazine. I think AP had them 7th preseason. They opened the season with Penn State, lost at home. Great memories. Maryland was, I always say it was the best 5.5 years of my life.
Well, Kevin, one of the great things about Maryland, it ends up leading into your first job, and you end up meeting a fellow Terp there. Your life, kind of close to lifelong association with your good friend, Scott Van Pelt. What are your early memories of meeting SVP?
Oh boy. I don't know. A lot of people think that we were really good friends at Maryland. We actually didn't really even know each other. We were there at the same time, but we met each other when I had a job. It was my first job at Fox Channel 5, working for the great Steve Buckhantz. And a lot of guys were at that place that have been in the business forever. Joe Yasharoff, Larry Duvall, so many people. Frank Crisafoli came along. But Scott was an intern right after I got hired, and we became fast friends. And we've been friends ever since. I mean, that's 30-something years ago now. We've just been super close forever. It's weird because we're the best of friends, but until a couple of years ago, he didn't live here. He lived in Orlando. He lived in Hartford, when he went to ESPN. But this is home for him, and he was able to come back, which has been great.
Yeah, SVP, and obviously loved hearing you guys chatting on your show, and I love following him. You mentioned Fox 5. That was...
Let me just tell you, here's the thing that was the first impression of Scott, and I don't even know if people know this about him. I tell people this all the time, is he was hysterically funny, and he did all of these impersonations. He had a real gift, quick wit, the whole thing. We got along right from the jump, but he's to his friends, we've known him forever as hysterically funny. It doesn't always come through, on SportsCenter, his SportsCenter. It does sometimes, and also on Monday Night Countdown. But I think all of us that work there, the first memory is he's 6'6", and then 2 is he was very funny.
Kevin, you mentioned your time at Fox 5 and the great Steve Buckhantz. And one of the things I remember about that group was the fact that I feel like you guys were the number 4, because it was during that kind of sports war of, you and I have talked about this, the great sports war of the 80s, where you have George Michael versus Glenn Brenner versus Frank Herzog versus Buck. And you kind of mentioned this when you talked about your days at Whitman. It's how do you find a way to compete and be good? And I remember one of the things about Five was you guys did the scrimmages. You guys had Georgetown basketball. There were a lot of things that the bigger stations didn't have that you guys did. Kind of tell me about the experience of fighting that good fight alongside a Buck as one of the privates, if you will.
Well, it wasn't just Buck, but it was Ernie Bauer, who's a legend in this town. I mean, Ernie directed Warner Wolf at Channel 9, you know, in the 70s. And Ernie was really the leader of all of the football programming. And by the way, and I've said this many times to people who have asked me about like your first work experience, first job working for Steve Buckhantz and Ernie Bauer was about as good as it could get for a young person, in part because it was a lot of fun, but also they were incredibly encouraging and would give people like me, 22 years old, you know, 23 years old, a lot of responsibility. And that was really, really incredible. And like the development of, you know, a young person professionally. But Ernie was, you know, the creator of Redskins Playbook, which was the Monday Night Live show where he was the first really to put writers, you know, on a TV set and have them opine, you know, in a live television setting. You know, Tony, I think, was on it. He had a lot of different writers that would come in and there would be one player. We had the preseason games. We produced and carried the scrimmages. So we were, you know, I was only there for 2 years before I left that business. Came back to it later, but it was such a talented group, and you had a different time slot. Remember, it was a 10 o'clock newscast, so you weren't directly competing with George Michael, Glenn Brenner, and Frank Herzog. But Buck would sit there every night in the studio after getting like 4 minutes for sports. And all of us who ever worked for Buck will tell you, he'd sit in his office, he'd look at his watch, and he'd time how many minutes Brenner and George Michael got. And he would just say, they got 11 minutes tonight. I got 4. How can we compete with that? But then the best part about Buck was once the show was over, he picked up the tab wherever we went for years and still will when you go out with him. He was so generous. We had a great time. And those guys were together much longer, you know, after I left. But a guy by the name of Paul Farnsworth, who is still a good friend of all of ours, even though we don't hear from him as much because he lives up in New York or Boston. I forget where he is right now. But we had a really fun group at that station. And yeah, we were kind of the underdog, but Ernie and Buck were phenomenal to work for.
Kevin, you mentioned that you end up getting out of the business after a couple of years. What was the impetus for you deciding to put sports to the back burner in your life?
Probably money, to be honest. Yeah, no, I got an opportunity. And I remember like in a startup company, and then I had the bug of being involved in startups kind of after that for, 14 years before I came back to broadcasting. And that was it. I mean, unless for television sports, unless you were going to be in front of the camera, and even that was going to be like Buck started in Harrisonburg, Virginia, home of the James Madison Dukes, his alma mater. Then he got his big break in Chattanooga, then went to Atlanta before he finally made it to a top 10 market in DC. But it's a long haul. And, you're moving all over. You're not making that much money until you get into a top 10 market situation. So I kind of looked at it as a producer back then. It was a living. I'm not knocking it, but it wasn't really what I was kind of looking for at the time. And I was presented with an opportunity, and it turned out really well.
Kevin, what are some of those businesses that you were involved in, or at least the style of what they were? I've always heard this about you, that you kind of got into these startups, and I'm kind of always picture what would Sheehan be in and getting into to try and make a big deal out of? What were some of the businesses that you kind of got involved with?
Well, the business that we were involved in mostly is now a massive business everywhere. Online grocery shopping and delivery. Like if you know what Peapod is,
Mm-hmm.
Peapod's still in the market. It's the giant service. Our company and Peapod were the two biggest startups and early stage companies in the space in the 90s. And we created, internet shopping capability through supermarket relationships that we had all over the country. And then actually, long story short, but we ended up bringing it in-house. We built warehouses and went direct to the consumer out of warehouses after they had shopped via our website. So I spent a lot of time in that business, but there were 3 or 4 others along the way that we got involved in before getting back into broadcasting.
It amazes me. I just always, because I Sheehan did this, and I heard, okay, he did this business, and I hear the backstory on it, and the Peapod part always kind of made me laugh.
Yeah,
How
Peapod
great you were at it.
was our direct competitor, and the guy that started Peapod, his name's Andrew Parkinson, is still, I think, running that company.
Wow.
I haven't talked to him in years. I think I talked to him maybe 7 or 8 years ago, because I think out of the blue, he's like, "Are you a sports broadcaster in Washington, D.C.?" I'm like, "Yeah," and I have been for about 10 years. And that was like 7 or 8 years ago. But yeah, that was it. There were several other tech startups. Yeah. And then getting back into broadcasting was really the interesting story, which was essentially me putting together kind of a fake play-by-play tape, sending it to Catholic University because they had posted that they needed somebody to do play-by-play of their games. Division III college football, you're familiar with that.
Yep.
They said, and I had Buck, and I had Ernie Bauer, and I had Scott as my references. That's all I needed. They gave me the job. I did 1 season of play-by-play of Catholic football for nothing, and then put together a play-by-play reel along with some updates, because a friend of mine knew Bennett Zier at Clear Channel. I went in and talked to him. He's like, "You don't want to do this, do you?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And he said, "But you actually really need to know a lot about sports." And I said, "Yeah, I think I can handle that part. That part I'm not concerned about." He's like, No, you really need to know a lot about sports. You got to listen to our guys, Andy Poland and Steve Zabin. I'm like, I listen to them all the time. They're great. Anyway, they gave me a weekend update position, Jeremy. And the first update I did, I didn't even know how to do an update. The night before, I remember asking Scott Lynn, who was, the primary update guy, "Is this kind of how you do it?" He's like, "Yeah." And he gave me some pointers. And I did it on Preakness Saturday. Bram was at Pimlico doing a live show, threw it back to me for updates. Didn't know. I mean, I was winging it, really. But 2 weeks later, the woman who was doing morning updates between Monday and Friday, her name was Meredith Joseph. She was there forever. She was great. She went on maternity leave, and no one wanted to do it. I offered to take the gig, but I was with a company that I had an 18-month contract to stay on with them. But the company was based in Baltimore, but I didn't have to go to Baltimore every day. I had to go to Baltimore like twice a week. And I got it to the point where I could go after my update shift was over. So, when you're doing early morning updates, you're in at 4:35. I was doing 6 to 11:40, something like that. And then I'd go into work and work my real job. But she never came back from maternity leave. She decided to be to stay at home and raise her. I think it was her daughter was her first child. And 2 weeks after they gave me the job full time, Kornheiser came back to radio, and I was doing updates during his show. So it was really very lucky. Like, if she didn't go on maternity leave, I would have not been talking to you right now. I would have never met you. If Tony didn't come back to do radio and he hadn't made me a part of his show, I don't know how long I would have stuck it out. But one thing led to another. Those were 2 breaks, and I just happened to have been in the right place at the right time. And then eventually I got a show after they realized that I knew a little bit about sports.
Kevin, I got to go back a few steps, and thank you for taking me through all that. I think you burned through about 6 of my questions.
I wanted to short track it for you.
But here's a question for you. You're going from doing these businesses that are doing pretty well. You're traveling a lot. I remember you talking about that. You're all over the place. When did the conversation happen with your wonderful wife that, hey, I think I can get into sports talk? And what was her reaction?
So, like, she thought it was just kind of a joke early on. Like, what are you doing? But remember, in those early days, I had a real job. I was doing the updates, but then I was going to a real job for that first, year and a half. The biggest thing I remember, I did travel for about 14 years. I was on the road four days a week on average. I basically commuted back and forth between here and Boston for a year and a half prior to saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I had young kids. They were very young at the time. I didn't like being away as much as I was. And I listened to sports talk radio in every city I was in. Like, I would look for the sports talk radio station, and I was addicted to it. And at the time, like when 980 launched, it was the first, 24/7 sports talk station in DC. It was in 92, right after the Skins won the Super Bowl, when they were the defending champs, and TEM got the rights to carry the games. But it wasn't until 10 years later, that I, got the gig doing updates. 11 years later, it was 2003, 2004, 2003, 4. And, but I always loved sports talk radio, and I always thought I could do it. I mean, everybody thinks they can do it. And I also had a passion for play-by-play, but that was going to be a harder thing. Maybe it would have. I don't know. Actually, being a show host on a show, as you know, is really hard. It was right time, right place, really, because again, I would have just gone on to the next business startup had Meredith not gone on maternity leave, honestly, because when she was about to come back, I remember they were saying, so when she comes back, we'd still like you to keep you, part-time to do weekend updates, etc. And I was thinking to myself, yeah, I'm not going to do that, because she was gone for, 2 months or whatever it was. And I had gotten into that routine, but but it was wild. She was really good too. I don't know if you remember. She was one of the best update people there was. Yeah. And then Tony was really the big break ultimately. Yeah.
Kevin, from the way you're kind of talking, this reminds me of one of my previous episodes with Chris Nocky, who obviously you know so very well, where he kind of said, look, I don't look back. I kind of make a decision and go. Are you that type of person? It sounds that way from, you're saying, look, this is nice, but I'm not going to do weekends. I'm going to go find something else. Is that your personality to say, look, I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to throw everything into it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Yeah, there aren't a lot of 3-hour meetings and consensus builder meetings. Yeah, and it's not the way I was. Fly by night sometimes doesn't work out, but sometimes mentally going through every single possible outcome is also exhausting and isn't necessarily fruitful. So yeah, Tommy always says this about me. He's like, you are definitely one that prefers to beg for forgiveness rather than ask for permission. And I think I've always been that way. So I kind of went into that thing like exuding some level of confidence, even though I really didn't know what I was doing. But those guys were great. Like the station, when I got there, Andy and Zabe were doing afternoons. Coach, and Doc were doing the middle of the day. Tony was doing mornings, and we were running, Mike and Mike from 6 to 10. And it was such a great atmosphere. You remember probably I don't know if you ever got to Rockville or Silver Spring with TEM. I don't think you did you?
They kind of brought me over sort of after the fact. There's a story behind that, which we're not going to get into today.
It was so much fun. It was such a fraternity type of atmosphere. I missed that about the station. COVID kind of changed everything a little bit. But we had a blast. I mean, CJ, Scott Lynn, Scott Jackson, Zabe, Andy, Tommy, me, Coach, Doc, Brian. I mean, the list goes on and on. We had a great time. It was very Zabe always described it as, you got to make people feel like they're a part of a club, and we're all kind of the, in the club with them. And the shows were, Doc was always having me on, or Doc would be on with me. We're doing each other's shows. It's a really good spot there for a long time. I miss that. I think all the guys do kind of miss what it was.
Kevin, you mentioned your time with Kornheiser and you kind of get thrust onto the show. It's weird, as a guy who's listened to Tony for as long as I have. I started listening to his show on TM back in the early 90s as basically a high schooler. And, he gives off the kind of prickly appearance. When you came into his world, was it an immediate like, hey, he's here, he's going to do his job? How did that kind of relationship go between you and Tony at first, and how did it develop?
I don't honestly remember. I remember, obviously Tony was already a bit of a legend. He came back to radio after doing Monday Night Football.
Yep.
He had done that Monday Night Football stint with Theismann, and so he came back to do local morning radio, which he was obviously brilliant at. And I just happened to have been going in there 3 times an hour to do updates, and then I would bet you he would say he wouldn't remember, but if he were forced to come up with an answer, and he'd probably be right, it would have something to do with weather, because he was always obsessed and neurotic about weather, and I was always into weather. And I'm sure it started with me saying, you hear, we're going to get 4 to 6 inches tomorrow. And he freaked out. And then I started explaining why we were going to get it and why we wouldn't. And then he's like, you got to come in here and you got to do weather, or you got to do some news updates, or something like that. But I love Tony right from the beginning, still do. I see him occasionally, talk to him still. We play golf occasionally. And I mean, he really was the reason I started a podcast, because I didn't even think about it. And he had launched his, which is still very, very successful. But being, we had at that station, right? We had Coach Thompson, Tony Kornheiser, former players, but just Coach and Tony alone in the same, space. It was a cool time. Now, Tony was kind of his own, over here entity. And Coach was always a part of the, the fraternity, the outside the studio. We had a great sort of war room, and we had a great time. But Tony was awesome to me, still is.
Yeah, Kevin, I want to get a little deeper into that story. I heard you tell it about the podcast. I think when you had Tony on your podcast about maybe 6 months ago, how that it sounded like that, to me at least, that Sheehan confidence wasn't there. And Tony looked at you and said, almost the Cher Nick Cage moment, snap out of it. Like, you built a brand here. This is going to work for you. Is that kind of how it went in your eyes, that you had to have that reassurance of Tony saying, nah, man, this is you? Yeah, for the podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what had happened, we got bought by a company called Urban One, and they started cutting and slashing, and they came to me and they said, we want you to continue to do the show without Cooley, because I was doing the show with Cooley at the time, for 40% less. And I said, yeah, right. And I'm like, no, thank you. And they said, well, that's fine. And so Tony's like, well, you got to do a podcast. I'm like, a podcast? Because remember, this is 6 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like everybody was going to do a podcast then. And he and Mark Stern, Mark was his producer, Nigel. I think most people know Mark is Nigel. I think they do. And Mark is still one of my good friends. They're the ones that basically said, no, you got to do this, because the hardest thing to do when you launch a podcast is to build an audience. You're going to be bringing one with you, so you should do this. It wasn't that I lacked confidence in doing it. It was, I didn't think it was going to make sense economically, or like I was just going to be, putting these out for friends and family members. You know what I mean? But it started off great, and it's it's the thing that I mean, I love doing radio and I love doing the podcast. I've got Tommy on with me twice a week. Hopefully Cooley will start to watch some football this year. He has not watched any football the first 2 weeks of the season, but we can get him to start doing some film breakdown occasionally. But Tony was a big part of that. He and Mark really helped me with that. Mark's helped with a lot of things.
Kevin, one thing I always say about you is it feels like, you're everybody's buddy. And the fact that you can get in there with different folks you've hosted shows with, but it feels like it always kind of flows like two buddies talking. Is that something that you've worked on, or is that just your personality to be that guy that guys just like talking sports with?
That's nice of you to say. I'm trying to think because I've had many partners, right? I worked with Rigo. That was priceless. I loved that. I worked with Doc. Loved that. Tommy was the one that I had the longest relationship with. We did a show for 7.5 years together. And still, he is on my podcast twice a week. And I've always loved Tom. We're very different. We think differently about a lot of things, but he's a treasure, man. And he's also perfect because he's kind of polarizing, and that works usually. And then I worked with Cooley for nearly 3 years. And then for the last many years, I've been doing solo. But I think, honestly, it's been that I've been lucky to have. Here's one of the things that I'm convinced of. Rigo, Doc, Tommy, Cooley. There was always a shared sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that goes a long way. And it was always, and I think this is really crucial in the business. And, if for those that listened when I was doing Tony's show for all those years, if you're not willing to be kind of the butt of the joke and laugh at yourself at least some of the time, that's a great quality to have, and it can be a devastating lack of quality unless you've got some other hook. But I think everybody that I've worked with doing a show with, where you're spending all of that time every day, 3 to 4 hours a day with, then you're talking to those people for another 3 hours, every day, trying to get ready for the next show. I think there was always a shared sense of humor. And I think that was big. And I think also there was always a healthy respect for the work that everybody put into it and, the knowledge or whatever. Yeah. I would say that that's probably a big part of why I still love doing stuff with Doc, even to this day. Still love doing stuff with Cooley. Rigo, I barely talk to him, rarely at all. I mean, he's been out of the business now for a while, but he was incredible to work with. I mean, talk about no ego for a guy that should have had a big ego. Great sense of humor, incredibly smart, and zero ego, which, by the way, was Cooley too. Cooley was super smart, no ego.
Yeah, it was. I got a few chances filling in for you to interact with Rigo. My big moment was the fact that I told him I was going to a beer festival on the weekend, which happened to be at Morven Park, which happened to be basically 2 miles as the crow flew from when he used to live in the trailer off the Potomac River. So
yeah.
Rigo knew that area very well. And
right.
I remember my buddies, we kind of said, I was like, look, I would have driven him. I've been his DD. I would have picked him up in Maryland just for the story of taking Rigo to a beer festival. Kev, a couple more left with you. You end up back with 980 after things kind of go through. You run the podcast for a while. They bring you back. How'd that come about? And was it kind of satisfying to come back after they had kind of, I think, unceremoniously showed you the door?
I mean, it wasn't that long after I left. I mean, it was 9 months later, and they called me to ask me to come back. And I'm like, yeah, but it's going to be for more than, what it was before, kind of a thing. But actually it worked out really well. The only thing that I didn't, and I still don't love, my favorite thing is to work with somebody versus without somebody. Like I've always preferred having a co-host, Cooley, Tommy, Doc, Riggo. Gary Braun, by the way, was a big part of the Riggo show too. And he was excellent. And so I've got a producer right now who's excellent on the air, Denton Day. And that's actually been really, really helpful for me, because when you're doing, this, when you're doing a solo show, and I did solo morning drive for 5 years, solo. That's the hardest thing. I'm not asking anybody to feel sorry for me, but the hardest thing to do in long form talk radio is solo in the mornings, especially for sports, because you want to stay up and watch stuff. And then you got to get up super early, and it's a grind physically because of the hours. So that's the one thing, is that I did come back, and Denton's phenomenal. It's been a bit of a rejuvenation for me to have a guy that I can lean on, a guy that, by the way, is an excellent producer as well. Great kid. I say kid, he's about to get married. Yeah, I mean, I've always preferred, that's why on the podcast, I always prefer to have a co-host or at least one guest, where it's more conversational than an interview. But anyway, yeah.
Kevin, before we close this one out, I got to ask you, because you were a guy that was a little bit ahead of the curve on this gambling. I know in the past, I believe hearing stories about you and SVP kind of talking about betting back in the day. In your eyes, where obviously you were into it, I think I've heard you say that you had been approached by a couple of folks about doing gambling shows, but you didn't really want to go that heavy into it. Your thoughts on kind of being ahead of the curve when it came to it being a part of your show, not the whole thing?
God, you know way too much about me.
Research, man, research.
How do you know all this? Well, yes. I mean, look, I was a sports bettor, always was. So talking sports betting was very natural. And I knew intuitively that there were so many people out there that loved that kind of content. And there weren't a lot of people doing that, like at our station. Like, Andy and Zabe weren't bettors, and the former players weren't. And so I did a lot of it on the show. Scott did a lot of it on his stuff. Bad Beats was, and I think we were talking Bad Beats in 1992. But what's interesting about what you said is, when all of the legalized sports betting started to occur state by state, a lot of, sports networks started to create these gambling networks 24/7. VSiN's a good example of it. Tim Murray does a show for VSiN. He's phenomenal. Aaron Oster, who produces my podcast, worked for VSiN for a while out in Vegas. They all moved out to Vegas, but NBC and a bunch of others were trying to figure it out. So I did actually get a couple of offers to host kind of 3-hour gambling shows, but I didn't want to talk about gambling for 3 hours. I actually think it is, for most listeners, better in sort of short form, niche form. Mm-hmm. Because what are you doing in June when the NBA finals are over and you got nothing but baseball and baseball lines and totals to talk about? Like, now, a lot of those things have really worked. VSiN's done well. I mean, I'm not saying that it wasn't, these things weren't going to work. They have. Murray's phenomenal on his show. But I want to, this about me. I'm a DC sports talk host. That's really, like, somebody like Zabe, out of all the people we've ever worked with, he's the one that could do any market, do national shows, which he did that was never me. I was much better suited to doing a DC sports talk show. And I think I realized early on, because there were a couple of opportunities to do national things, I'm like, I just don't think I'd be into it as much as I'm into this. And I don't think I'd be as good doing those as I am doing one where I think it's really important in sports talk radio locally I don't think it's critical that you're a fan of the teams, but I think you have to have knowledge and historical knowledge of the teams. At least in the past, you've needed that.
I think you still need it, Kevin. I think not to heap too much praise on you, but I'm an avid listener to your podcast. I would say, but kind of at this point, you're kind of one of the deans of it in DC, but a lot of folks go to you because they know Kevin Sheehan remembers the George Allen Redskins or Wes Unseld on the Bullets, all these things, and you've seen it kind of advance throughout the years, as opposed to someone maybe parachuting in, doesn't know all those back things. And I'm a sports radio nerd, kind of like you were, where it is one of those things where it unnerves me to no end when somebody doesn't know a basic point on something or a basic historical point. So it's always good to have you and your voice and that memory of, yeah, I know Kevin was there. Kevin was at RFK. He saw all this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, for how much longer will people care about those things? I don't know, but that's nice of you to say. But, like Andy was always that way too.
Yep.
Like I think Andy and I have been the two people that really kind of, Andy maybe even more, so although Andy didn't go to games, Andy was never one that went to all those games, but Andy's got incredible, sort of historical knowledge as well. But that's nice of you to say. And yeah, I mean, it's because I loved the teams and yeah, I was there. I grew up in RFK Stadium and went to all of those big games.
Kevin, I'm going to wrap it up on this, and thank you so much. And I kind of picked this to the end because you might want to hang up on me after I tell you this story. When you were in your search for work, so you're Catholic, you're Montgomery 21, I believe was the cable channel.
I did do Montgomery 21.
Doing all those things.
Yeah.
You, I believe, were sending different things out. And I remember, this is one of the things you remember 5 years after the fact. You sent a demo to Wage Radio in Leesburg, Virginia. And I was the sports director. I was like 23 years old.
Yeah.
And I saw it and I said, this might have to go into the circular file. Not because I didn't want to help anybody out, but because I was a 23-year-old kid. And this, you mentioned Grant Paulson. There's a guy I know, his name was Bruce Bornarth. I used to do high school football with him. He had buddied up with Grant back at camp when Grant was kind of cub reporter. Bruce had gotten his job taken away as the voice of our high school football by a incoming salesperson who had kind of moved his way in. So I said, yeah, I don't think I can let this happen. So I didn't help you in your chase, but I could say this, Kevin.
I'm glad you didn't offer me the gig.
And I could say,
where was Wage Radio? I don't even know where it is.
Leesburg, Virginia. We were the George Washington affiliate at the time. We were their flagship, which made no sense when Larry was doing the games back. Larry Michael was doing the games. But I can say this honestly, Kevin, that I've listened to you for so long. I think I've paid you back. If I didn't help you get the job then, I've helped you keep your job since, being a loyal listener to your pod and all the different shows you've done.
Well, you're so nice, and you know how much and how fond I've been of you and your work over the years. Good luck with this. You'll do great with it.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining Huber and Friends.
Thanks, Jeremy.